So yesterday we talked about the idea of justice and trying to understand justice from a gospel-centered, biblical-centered, God-centered view. How does God view justice? How does justice work in God's economy, in the gospel economy? And that's what we need as Christians to understand first if we're going to pursue justice on a social level, on that sort of terms and level. And so today's topic is kind of actually similar, related to that, and it's the idea of reconciliation. So 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul writes this: "Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God." So again, some of the similar language that we see Paul uses in Romans, he uses here in this text in 2 Corinthians, this idea of being reconcilers. Reconcilers who have been reconciled to God. So since we've been reconciled to God, Paul argues, we are now ambassadors of that. We are representatives of that reconciliation. And reconciliation is this idea that something's broken. There's a rift in a relationship. There's tension there. There's conflict there. And amends needs to be made. That's how we, before Christ, that's how we look at our relationship between us and God. There's a chasm, there's a rift in our relationship, there's brokenness in our relationship that needs to be healed and mended, and that's what Christ did. The amazing statement that he makes in 2 Corinthians is that he became sin so that he who knew no sin became sin so that we who were sinful might become the righteousness of God. So if you're a follower of Christ, you've been reconciled back to God, you then have been tasked with bringing that reconciliation to the rest of the world, to God. Now, ultimately, we know our biggest problems are not merely physical brokenness and physical problems, which there is. As a result of sin, there's brokenness in our human relationships, but our biggest problem is tied back to our broken relationship with God. And if we can fix that chasm, if we can amend that relationship, then it's certainly possible to mend human broken relationships. And so we are ambassadors of that. We're representatives of that. We're proclaimers of that. And as Paul implores the Corinthians, he says, I'm begging you to be reconciled back to God through Christ, who became sin on our behalf. Be reconciled back to God. That's what we're begging people to do. So at the root of all the brokenness, the unrest, the civil unrest, the injustices that we see around us, we can make new laws, we can fight for reform, we can fight for change, but ultimately we know that if people aren't reconciled back to God, if we don't come back to God, if that relationship with God is not restored and fixed, then ultimately all this other stuff is only going to take us so far, and at best it's just going to be superficial change and not real reconciliation. Because real reconciliation comes through Christ shedding his blood on the cross for our sins, becoming sin, perfect spot. Let that sink in for a moment. He became sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God, that we might be reconciled back to him. And now we're tasked with taking that message to the world. And in all of your fighting and all your struggling and all your raging against injustice and all your standing up against that and fighting for the oppressed and all of that, if it's not undergirded and empowered by and motivated by the fact that through Christ we've been reconciled to God, then all that we're ever actually going to bring about is superficial change that's not lasting, and we're just going to keep having these same conversations. So as we talk about justice, and I mentioned before that a lot of it is just motivated by political agendas and not real justice and not real fixing the problems, and there's just a lot of murkiness and muddiness. We have a clear path to reconciliation through Christ and his cross. So not only does it fix the horizontal relationship that we have with God, but it also makes amends it fixes our vertical relationship with God, but it also makes amends with our horizontal relationships. We have the key that will actually bring about change, that unlocks the door to change. And that's through the reconciliation that Christ has brought and us being ambassadors of that reconciliation.